Our story begins in February 1847. A group of men in Chicago were planning to build a railroad. There was a lot of riverboat traffic on the Illinois River and also a lot of riverboat traffic on the Mississippi River. Now the problem was the only way to haul goods from the Illinois to the Mississippi was by horse and wagon. So these men were planning to build a railroad from LaSalle, Illinois, that's the arrow on the right, to Rock Island, Illinois, to the arrow on the left. Now, after some planning, they changed their minds and they decided they'd build the railroad from Chicago to LaSalle, and then from LaSalle they'd lay the track on over to Rock Island. Now, they had the track laid for about 40 miles from Chicago to Joliet, Illinois. And they decided to have a memorial train running from Chicago to Joliet. And their engine, or their locomotive, was called the Rocket. This was the first Rock Island rocket. I remember the Rocket when it came through Eldon, and it certainly looked a lot different from this one. Anyway, they loaded their passenger cars and off they went from Chicago to Joliet. Had a great trip, a big celebration in Joliet. And the train returning to Chicago took longer. And the reason, they had no way to turn the train around. So it was a backup trip to Chicago. They took that trip in reverse. Now in February 1854, they had laid their tracks from Chicago to Rock Island. And in our country, it was go west, young man, go west. And the Rock Island, they decided that they would also like to go west. But in order to do so, they'd need to build a bridge across the Mississippi River. And they turned this over to the Rock Island Bridge Company. And this was their plan for this great bridge over the Mississippi. Now, things had gone fairly smoothly so far, but those things were about to change. There were lots of steamboat traffic on the Mississippi River. The riverboat companies were prosperous, and they did not want any competition from a railroad. They figured the bridge across the Mississippi River would indeed be a nuisance. Now, the president of the Chicago Rock Island Railroad was able to get a bill through the Illinois legislature, and this bill permitted the Rock Island Bridge Company to build the bridge. Now, the steamboat owners, they didn't keep still. They applied pressure to the Secretary of War, who was Jefferson Davis. And Jefferson Davis directed the U.S. Attorney to secure an injunction against the bridge. So it was the case of the U.S. versus the railroad. And in the circuit court in July 1855, the judge decided in favor of the railroad. Now, the bridge was built and completed April 21st, 1856, and it was a wooden bridge, the first railroad bridge across the Mississippi. That was a drawbridge because some of the steamboats had tall stacks and they couldn't go under the bridge spans. Now, April 21st, 1856, the locomotive Des Moines crossed the bridge. Now, shortly after, May 6, 1856, a steamboat hit the wooden bridge, and the wooden bridge and the steamboat were both set afire. The boat was destroyed, and it took 4 months to repair the bridge. So we're back to court. The steamboat people are suing the railroad. And in his concluding remarks, which were several hours long, of course they were against the railroad. Now the railroad had a young lawyer. Maybe you'll recognize him. It was Abraham Lincoln. In his concluding remarks, which were only a few minutes, he told the jury they must decide if a man had more rights to travel up and down the river than another man has to cross the river. And the jury threw the lawsuit out. But this wasn't the end of things. A judge rendered a decision to tear down the bridge. December 1862, the Supreme Court reversed this decision to tear down the bridge. So the Rock Island was going to have their bridge over the Mississippi, and they were ready to go into the state of Iowa. One of their first big trips, they loaded up the locomotive Washington, and they had 13 passenger cars fully loaded, and they went to the town of Washington. There was a great celebration. The people were so happy that the railroad was coming into their town. And of course, the people that were on the train, they were so happy to have such an excursion. Now I need to back up just a little bit. About 7 miles north of where Eldon is was a town called Ashland, and it was settled in 1847. They had an inn with 20 rooms. They had a large stable for stagecoach horses. They had a Methodist church. They had a store. They had a university. And they were full of great expectations for this university to be a great learning institution. Now, one reason that Ashland was a boom town, it was a stagecoach stop. Now, the trains started wheeling through the state of Iowa. And on October the 28th, 1870, Rock Island engine number 45 rode into Ashland Crossing, which was to become Eldon. At Ashland Crossing, post office was built. And the post office called this little spot in the road Williamsburg. And the town, this little wide spot in the road, it was also called Jordan City. And that was named after a James Jordan, who was an Indian trader and an early settler. And this was James Jordan's house, which was south of Eldon. And I think it was torn down in the 60s. And in 1870, James Love made the first plot of the town and gave it the name Eldon. And Eldon was incorporated into a town in 1873. Eldon had a perfect situation. It was halfway in between Trenton and Rock Island. It became a Rock Island division point. So Eldon was destined to become a boom town. Now in the 1890s, land around Eldon was worth $20 to $40 an acre. And things really did start booming. I found this little enterprise kind of interesting. The Rock Island Saloon and the Vienna Bakery all looks like they're just about together. Eldon had a lumber yard, which it needed because of the building. In 1893, they organized their fire department, which was fully functional. They had 1,000 feet of hose. They had a hook and ladder wagon. They had a chemical wagon. And they were ready for the fires that were to come to Eldon. Now, there were 3 hotels in Eldon. This was the Exchange Hotel. A lot of passengers who had a stopover in Eldon stayed at the Exchange. It had 30 rooms, mainly on the 2nd and 3rd floor. And the 1st floor, they had a large lounge with a dining room. Now, other things were also booming. There were 5 dry goods stores, 7 grocery stores, 3 drug stores, 3 blacksmith shops, 4 barber shops, a furniture store, and there was churches of 6 denominations, several doctors, and a lawyer. Now in 1895, Eldon would get its first bank. It was the Bradley Bank, and they have loans from $10 to $50. They were doing 2 or 3 months, and they charged 8% for their interest rate. This bank became the Eldon Savings Bank, as you can see here. Now, Eldon was growing in leaps and bounds. From 1900 to 1905, its population grew from 1,800 to 2,300. There were only 5 cities in the whole state of Iowa that had an increase in population. Eldon became a city of second class. In 1897, on January the 24th, there was a sleeting storm and the night was unfit for travel. The Eldon City Marshal organized a gang of hoodlums to rob the Bradley Bank. Now they blew a hole in the vault large enough so a man could enter. The hole was drilled with explosives. Now people in the hotel, they were awakened, but they thought it was probably a couple of freight cars coming together in the railroad yards, which was busy and also noisy. Now the driver of the wagon, he was scared off and he headed for Tumwa. So the stranded men who robbed the bank, they stole a team and wagon from the barn of R. Ritz, who owned a local grocery store. They drove to Ottumwa, and of course the Eldon Marshal stayed behind. They divvied up the loot early the next morning, and they left the Marshal empty-handed. Furthermore, they left that evening on a train for Chicago. Now the Marshal made several trips to Chicago for his share of the loot, but every time he came away empty-handed. The bank turned the detective job over to the Pinkertons, and they tracked down all of the responsible men. They went to trial, and some were punished with long sentences. 1873 was the first school term for Eldon schools. They had 124 school-age children, and they started out by renting a room in the Parker House for $10 a month. Now, this building was used on the flat, and they also built the Lincoln School on the hill. It was for the 8th grade and 4 years of high school. Now, in 1903, Eldon High School was built. The elementary schools, the elementary students on the flat, and all the high school students went to Eldon High. And the elementary students on the hill, they still went to the Lincoln School. Now, the Opera House was built in 1891. Now, Eldon was certainly growing. Now, the Opera House was going to play a big role in the Eldon High School activities. It had 4 dressing rooms, 600 seats, and the graduation exercises were held on the grand stage until 1941. Now, the Eldon High School didn't have a gym when it was built, but they did play basketball, and their basketball was played in the Opera House. And yes, they also had a girls' basketball team, and they played their basketball in the Opera House. You can still faintly see the stripes for the out-of-bound lines. They used the stage at the Opera House for their school plays. Now, the Opera House was also associated with the New York Circuit, and some grand plays played on the stage of the McAfee Opera House. Now, in 1927, the students going to Eldon High would have a regular-sized gym to play in. Through the years, Eldon has had several newspapers. There's the Eldon Forum, one called the Eldon Review. For a short period of time, they had the Eldon Bee, and also for a short period of time, they had the Star newspaper. This is a bird's eye view of boomtown Eldon. 1904 was a big year for Eldon and the fair. Teddy Roosevelt, he was campaigning for president, and he stopped off at the Eldon Fair. And there's no question about it, Eldon is on the map. Now, if someone would ask, do you remember Charlie Box? And they'd probably say, of course I do. He was a barber in town. Now, Charlie, he was a renowned musician. He played 7 instruments, played the cornet for the Rock Island Band in Trenton. He played for shows at the Opera House. He played 27 consecutive baccalaureate ceremonies for Eldon High School. He played on platforms with William Howard Taft, Theodore Roosevelt, William Jennings Bryan, Billy Sunday, and several Iowa governors. And he had many of his works published. In 1908, Charlie organized and directed the Eldon Concert Band. In the 1930s, Grant Wood visited the town of Eldon. He come to see John Sharp, who was an art student of his. And John was giving him the tour of Eldon, and they drove by what we call the Gothic House. Now, Grant Wood had been in Germany studying art. And he loved the Gothic windows. But those Gothic windows were in churches. He was surprised. See, this little house in Eldon, Iowa, with a Gothic window. So he had his friend stop the car, and he sketched out a drawing of the Gothic house. He went back to Cedar Rapids. Of course, he planned, and he did this famous painting. Now, he needed models. His sister wanted to be in the painting, and he wanted his dentist to be a model for the painting. But the dentist says, "No way will I dress up in bib overalls with a pitchfork and let you paint my picture." Now, this is the picture. This is what the sister looked like in real life. She had the wrong kind of hairdo for this picture, so she had to straighten her hair, and evidently she did. Now, Grant Wood told his dentist that if he would be a model, no one would ever recognize him. Now, you see the dentist on the right, the model, and then you see the result on the left. This famous painting has its own room in the Chicago Art Institute. I think this painting would put Eldon on the map. The summer of 1947. What a wet one. The Des Moines River was raging up and down the streets of Eldon. And basements were full or half full. You can see the pictures. The water receded, and many of the merchants cleaned out their stores and cleaned out their basements, only to have the water come up again for a second time and flooded them out for a second time. What a year 1957 was. January started off with a cold start. Temperatures dropping to 30 below zero. Early on the morning of January 26th, a fire broke out. It was discovered by Junior Bain on his way to work. The Eldon firemen had help from Ottumwa firemen, agency firemen, and Batavia firemen. If you look at the top picture here, it was so cold that the water in the hoses froze. This is a picture of the Batavia firemen trying to thaw out the water hoses. And then, of course, you can see the damage in the second picture. Now, the building on the left, that was Burtzel's men's store. The center building was the Eldon Forum, and the building on the right was the Iowa Liquor Store building. And there was a firewall between it and Bellamy Hardware, which saved Bellamy Hardware. This is the picture after the fire. It was indeed a blessing that the two gas pumps did not explode. Now, Frank Shane lost his law office, Charlie Box his barber shop. The Anvets on the second floor was burned, and so was George Cloak's trading post. In 1957, the new Eldon Bridge was started, and Bud Hughes opened the Dairy Duchess. Tommy Lyons and Jerry Potts won the Soapbox Derby. How could you talk about historical notes in the 40s and the 50s and 60s without talking about the hangout or Eldon High School kids at Whitey Jones? Everyone certainly enjoyed Saturday night the movies, going to Whitey's for a Coke. Now, Tom and Roseanne bought land and planned to build in Eldon. They'd come in from Hollywood to Eldon at all hours of the night, and there were no restaurants open. So they opened the Loose Meat Diner. I remember my wife one Saturday morning telling me to come in that Eldon was on CNN, and CNN was covering the grand opening of the Loose Meat Diner, and it seemed like Eldon was on the map again. It was a strange kind of thing with Roseanne and Tom. No one really knew what to think. It didn't last very long, and Eldon inherited the Loose Meat Diner, and that is now where our fire station is. This was a sad day in 1980 when the Rock Island Railroad went into bankruptcy. There are some volunteers in Eldon that do an unbelievable amount of work. Let's take a quick little trip to look at some of the things that are happening in Eldon today. This is the beginning of the path up to the Gothic House. Beautiful path to walk up. Walk around the next corner and you'll see the Gothic House. In the summertime, you'll see flowers. The yard will be immaculate. The trees will be pretty. And across from that, a lot of planning and hard work went into the American Gothic House Center. They have volunteers at the Gothic Center. I see those volunteers have planted some flowers out front. It seems like the Gothic House and the Pitchfork just about appears everywhere. There are a lot of people that visit the Gothic Center to learn more about this house and this pitchfork. Now, if you walk from the entrance to that path up to the Gothic house, you'll see our city park. And in the summertime, on the weekends, that city park may be buzzing with supper in the park. Then, of course, there's the Eldon Rock Island Depot. It's a train museum filled with all kinds of tools, lanterns, whatever the railroaders used, you'll find in this building. It makes a real interesting tour. Walking down the street, you'll see the McAfee Opera House. A lot of time and effort have gone into refurbishing the old Opera House. This Gothic Days in 2013, the Opera House will indeed come alive, as there will be some musicals in the Opera House. So as you see, thanks to the hard-working Eldon volunteers, Eldon is still on the map.
Yesterday, when I was young, so many happy songs were waiting to be sung. So many wild pleasures lay in store for me, and so much pain my dazzled eyes refused to see. I ran so fast the time, and youth at last ran out. I never stopped to think what life was all about, and every conversation I can now recall concerned itself with me and nothing else at all.